evening. Tonight, Albanese's own staff are demanding a big pay rise. Wait until you hear just how much they want. The Sydney shark attack victim speaks about her ordeal from her hospital bed. A judge is urging the Higgins-Reynolds defamation suit to be settled and settled quickly. We'll bring you the latest. And are the Obamas planning a return to the White House? It looks like it. But first tonight, how Australia has become a more racially, ethnically and economically divided country under Anthony Albanese's watch. We were all astounded and angry that 80 councils across the country changed the date of Australia Day citizenship ceremonies this year. Then today, a new level of disrespect. The New South Wales Premier was forced to intervene to stop a music concert drowning out the Anzac Day march in Sydney. We are now seeing an erosion of respect and appreciation for our country and those that have fought for us. And it struck me today that the fabric of life in Australia has changed considerably in just the past year. Social cohesion has fractured quite dramatically under Albanese. Leaders have a choice. They can govern for all voters, even those who don't support them, or they can choose to divide the country. Whatever the Prime Minister's intentions are, and presumably he thinks he's doing the right thing, but the reality is that we're now a nation more fractured with less respect for elders, tradition and values. Thanks to Albanese, we're seeing the re-emergence of old class warfare. The Prime Minister has scrapped sensible reform of the tax thresholds for high income earners. The workers Labor considers the top end of town, even though $146,000 could hardly be considered well off in major cities during this cost of living crisis. It's not fairness when, as the Australian reports, economist Chris Richardson calculates that the top 1% pay as much income tax as the bottom 71%. But Labor says this is unfair. Those above $146,000 need to pay an even higher share of the tax burden. Albanese doesn't want his tax package to be pitched as wealth redistribution. He's told his MPs not to mention fairness and to instead sell this as a solution to the cost of living crisis. But of course, this is classic class warfare. The Australian's Paul Kelly writes that it's been 5 years since the great union boss Bill Kelty called for Labor to be the aspirational party and cut the top marginal tax rate to about 40%. Paul Kelly says that such ideas are heretical inside today's Labor. He says that tactical geniuses that were convinced the voice referendum would pass have now made their follow-up tactical call that larger tax breaks for lower and middle income earners will resurrect Labor's electoral fortunes. But Paul Kelly notes that this is divisive policy that punishes taxpayers who earn more than $146,000. Now, aside from wealth redistribution, the splintering that we're seeing in our society really began during the Voice campaign, when the Albanese government accused no voters of racism, misinformation, and of being chicken littles of the past. In a major misjudgment, it turned out that more than half the country didn't support a Voice, so the Prime Minister insulted the majority of Australians. And the referendum divided families, classrooms and workplaces. Corporates angered their customers by telling them how to vote and what to do. The division between the elites and the suburbs emerged strongly, with families in the grip of a cost of living crisis that the political leadership simply didn't understand. And then the Voice defeat on October 14 melted into the aggression of the pro-Palestinian protesters. There was an escalation of hostility on our streets. The protesters brought their truculence and intimidation to the suburbs, the beaches and outside synagogues, while hate preachers incited violence and the Australian flag was burned on the steps of the Opera House. Shameful scenes, with police failing to arrest a single perpetrator, only one Jew. The Indigenous and Palestinian cause has now become quite absurdly intertwined.
The parallels between what happened here and what happened in Palestine are absolute. Always was, always will be. From the river to the sea.
Palestinian leaders like Nasser Mashni, who we've had a lot to say about in the past, well, he's wrongly claimed that Jews are not Indigenous to the land of Israel, even though Jews were living on the land of Israel for at least well over 1,000 years before the formation of the religion of Islam. The Palestinian protests were given moral licence by Albanese, who's continued to lecture Israel about abiding by international law, the implication from the Prime Minister that it hasn't been. And then you look at the Australia Day weekend that just passed, with men in black masks intimidating families at public parks and on trains. And you think Australia is unrecognisable. And I'll say it again, not one charge laid. Instead of celebrating our country, even mayors and local councils seem intent to divide us, with 80 cancelling citizenship ceremonies on Australia Day itself. We're seeing division on class, religion, ethnicity and income. And perhaps there was an undercurrent before, but the discord has well and truly bubbled to the surface in less than 12 months. The very fabric of Australian life has changed under Anthony Albanese. It's the role of leaders to unify citizens, to call out division, to stand up against anti-Semitism, to set the tone for our country and to defend our values, our standards and our principles. And sadly, we're not seeing that leadership from this Prime Minister. All right, to discuss this and the rest of the day's top stories, let's bring in now the Director of Headline Advisory, former Press Secretary to Scott Morrison, Andrew Carswell, great to see you, and Labor power broker Graham Richardson. Thank you both so much for your time. Look, Andrew, I want to get your reaction to what I've just spoken about. And, you know, when you take a step back and look at the bigger picture of the Australia that we're seeing, it's a massive change from just a year ago.
Well, even beyond that, I think before the last election, Sharri, the Prime Minister promised safe change. And in the last 2 years, we've seen nothing but division, disunity, disruption, and now we're seeing a flight towards classism and tribalism that is polarising Australians. This is the Australia that Anthony Albanese is building, a battleground. It is Indigenous versus non-Indigenous. It is employers versus employees. It is rich versus poor. It is the cities versus the country. It is unions versus big business. It is Muslims against Jews. It is a battleground wherever you turn, and it is on purpose. And we're seeing from the Prime Minister a return to type. This is not a new Prime Minister turning over a new leaf and going down a different path. This is a return to the old Anthony Albanese. This is who he is. He's a fighter, he's a brawler, he's a scrapper. He believes passionately about the things that he believes in and doesn't understand the beliefs and value system of those on the other side of the fence. And that is what we're starting to see here in Australia. The discourse is going downhill at a great rate, and the Prime Minister himself is to blame. And it's not like he's poking people in the eye purposely. He's not insulting people with his words. It's his silence on so many issues that Australians care deeply about, their value systems align with, and he just does not understand it. Therefore, he remains silent on it and loud on the issues that he cares about. When the slings and arrows go over the fence, he's silent, but when they come back this way, he is loud, and there's not a way to govern.
That is so well said, Andrew Carswell. Graham Richardson, I know you're a good friend of Anthony Albanese, but surely when you look at the black masked men who infiltrated parks on Australia Day, when you look at the aggressive protests, when you look at the burning of the Australian flag on the steps of the Opera House, surely this isn't the Australia that you recognise, that you love.
No, it isn't, but that isn't necessarily the fault of Anthony Albanese. I mean, you're always going to have people in your society who are on the fringe of it and who basically don't like that society. You know, we have a lot of those, unfortunately, and it's just something you've got to endure and put up with in a democracy. You can't do anything else about it. But it doesn't mean Albo's part of it. And I reject what's just been said entirely.
Yeah, well, look, we understand that you do, and you are a good friend of the Prime Minister's, but as Andrew Carswell just said, it's his silence. It's not standing up there and saying anti-Semitism is not on, this conduct is not on. It's being strong, it's showing leadership. And it's also local governments, state governments, actually arresting people and pressing charges, or if it is the federal government, introducing new laws so the hate preachers can't go on inciting violence like they've done. But let's move on to another topic. The Prime Minister's political staffers, this is according to an exclusive in the Sydney Morning Herald, are now demanding a 20% pay rise over 3 years. This is nearly double that of public servants. They also want a cost of living adjustment to combat inflation. And according to the Herald, they're using general comments made by the Prime Minister himself, also Tony Burke, the Minister for the Unions, on workplace culture to actually argue their case. Andrew, isn't this a bit rich when many of those advisors would be in the top tax bracket and the government has just scrapped bigger tax cuts for high-income earners?
I'm all supportive of advisors being paid well, and they are paid handsomely.
Well, you would be. You were just an advisor.
You can turn up to Canberra and get a job advising for 150k. On top of that, you get 30 grand for overtime. You can get a car allowance. It's a big whopping pay pack, and it's deserved because they work hard. But the extra cream on the top, and another 20%, it is a bridge too far, and it's a bit of a slap in the face to ordinary Australians going through a cost of living crisis without being able to bump their own salary up by 20%. The small business owners that haven't been able to pay themselves a pay rise in years. But this is what happens when you toy with the industrial relations system, and you put out there or you try and incentivise workers and unions going after big increases in pay. It turns out to be that one business goes, well, one group of workers goes to that business and goes, well, they've had a 9% pay rise, let's go for 10. And it spirals from there. And what it does, it leaves Australia in a very uncompetitive position.
Richo, this is a big gamble for the Prime Minister, breaking the Stage 3 tax cuts election promise. Do you think it's going to pay off for him?
When you say pay off, it's got to take some bark off him. I don't think you can break a promise of that size and not suffer some detriment, and so he will. But by and large, I think Australians would say, well, if circumstances change, we understand that governments have to change with them. Broken promises by politicians is hardly a big news story, exclusive, gee, look at this, isn't this unusual? It happens all the time.
But isn't the difference that the Prime Minister said, my word is my bond, and he promised a new form of politics. He promised transparency, accountability, honesty. I mean, that was his campaign against your old boss, Kazi, Scott Morrison. Yeah,
look, I understand that, but Albo has got, to face reality. He can't just, exist in some bubble of his own. He's got to face the reality around him. And sometimes that will mean changing your promises. Sometimes that it forces you to change your promises. I'd rather him act in response to reality than simply hide behind a promise he's made and stick there. You have got to be able to show that you have the kind of capacity to change when you need to, and that's what he's doing. I mean, and Labor is supposed to be the party of change, so we shouldn't be, really shocked and all react in horror that Labor would change something.
Well, it's supposed to be the party of reform, isn't it, Richo? And this was tax reform, and now the tax thresholds are not changing for a large group of people. Kazi, what do you think about this?
Well, it's tax regression, isn't it? And look, I think the Labor Party, if they really drill down on it and manage to sell this, could actually sell it from their own values point of view. But I don't trust their ability to sell. They've proven themselves to be very poor at the sales job on politics. So I don't back their ability to sell this. In terms of the judgment that Anthony Albanese has made here, he didn't want to go down this path. He was forced to by his cabinet. He was forced to by a treasurer that had been banging on about this for a year. So really this is a weakness that's being shown here by Anthony Albanese, failing to stand up to what he actually believed was the right thing, because he knew that this would be toxic. He knew this would be electorally seen as kryptonite, but he couldn't stand up to those forces on the left and the right in his own party that were pushing for this for a long period of time.
All right, big news story this week. The victim of Monday's bull shark attack in Sydney, Lauren O'Neill, she's now spoken from her hospital bed. She's given a statement that the Daily Telegraph has reported. She's just 29. She said she was taking a short dip close to the shore when she was bitten. She says she wasn't being reckless and she was well aware of the risk of swimming at dusk. She said she often went for a swim after work. Monday's swim, the temperatures were near 30 degrees, that she thought it would have been no different. Shark experts are trying to put the blame on her. But Richo, surely shark attacks are now becoming more common. Shouldn't we have more shark nets in place if there are a lot of bull sharks swimming around Sydney Harbour, as we're hearing in the past couple of days?
Yeah, I agree. I think, I keep hearing we've got to protect sharks. Well, I agree with that up to a point. I've got to rather protect people. They'd be my first preference. Human beings.
Yes.
They should be the ones being
100%.
protected.
Absolutely. Now, Andrew Carswell, I just want to get your reaction quickly to, the story I spoke about earlier in the show. The New South Wales Premier forced to intervene today to stop a music festival drowning out Anzac Day march in Sydney. Here was Chris Minns.
Lesson learned from the New South Wales government. I'm sorry that it's gone this far, but I want to make it clear and completely unambiguous today. There will not be a rock concert in the middle of the city on the same day as Anzac Day.
I mean, Kazi, it should never have got that far.
No, and he's made the right call here yet again. I mean, this guy is Captain Sensible.
Yes.
He's showing what good Labor leadership should be, in tune with the community, common sense approach to issues, and not afraid to use the word sorry. He won me over with the march that took place in Sydney and towards the Opera House, where horrible things were said about the Jewish community, and he apologised for that, allowing that to take place, and stood up and owned that. And I think he won a lot of people over by that position. So if he keeps along this path, he can be there as long as he wants.
Now, just before you go, this quite funny story coming out of the UK, that British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak apparently fasts for 36 hours every week. He only has water, tea or black coffee from 5 p.m. on Sunday to 5 a.m. on Tuesday. I mean, this follows a long tradition of British Prime Ministers doing kind of unusual things. Margaret Thatcher said to have only slept for 4 hours, I guess a bit like Kevin Rudd. Winston Churchill's daily routine was reportedly to gargle whiskey in the morning and drink champagne for lunch. Richo, did you have any odd routines when you were a minister?
Absolutely not. I was perfect. I did absolutely nothing wrong, and nary a drop of alcohol passed my lips.
Look, we don't expect you to spill all your secrets on live television, but Andrew, I don't know how you could function as the UK Prime Minister if you're not eating from 5 o'clock on Sunday to 5 o'clock on Tuesday. I mean, you really need fuel to keep your brain sharp.
Well, I'm a little different, Sharri. I think I eat 36 hours in a week. I'm the complete opposite. And look, I think this is just a part of the new craze, which is chasing longevity. You can walk past a local bookshop and you see books on the front that are all talking about longevity. People doing these routines in order to live 2 or 3 years longer than they ordinarily would. I'd rather take 2 years off and eat what I want when I want.
No, fair enough. Well, I fast every single day, from dinner to breakfast. And that's the type of fast I like. Now, Graham Richardson, Andrew Carswell, great to see you both. Now, a judge is ordering Brittany Higgins, her fiancé David Shiraz and Senator Linda Reynolds to try and settle the defamation dispute to avoid a lengthy 6-week case, stressing the human cost of this litigation. Higgins and Shiraz, as you know, have been flaunting their new life in France on social media, posting photographs of their 5-bedroom French chateau. that was likely bought with the help of the $2.4 million taxpayer-funded payout awarded to Higgins by the Albanese government. Photos also show them popping French champagne. They're reportedly flying business class flights on occasion, all while Australians are struggling with a cost of living crisis. Now, Linda Reynolds wants their assets frozen. She sought advice from a lawyer about whether she can even freeze their assets in France. Higgins has responded to this on social media by saying she won't be bullied. For more on this, let's bring in legal affairs expert Chris Merritt. Chris, great to see you here.
Hi.
So this case, this defamation case by Linda Reynolds, would be fresh off the heels of the Bruce Lerman defamation case. Where's that one up to?
Look, judgment's reserved. It could come down any time yet, and I think it would have an influence on these settlement talks, these mediation talks that have now been strongly suggested by the judge in this other case, this separate case. But quite frankly, I think the circumstances that prevail in the Linda Reynolds case make a settlement, it's a bridge too far in my view. I think Reynolds has been denied the ability to put her side of the argument. Remember, she was excluded from the mediation talks that resulted in Ms Higgins getting $2.4 million. She couldn't give her side of things and contest the Higgins argument. We've also got what looks like the collapse of the argument in the Wilkinson-Lerman defamation case, the collapse of the argument that there was a cover-up, at least as far as Fiona Brown, Reynolds' Chief of Staff, was involved.
And so if there has been the collapse of that argument, and Justice Michael Lee seems to have made it clear in some of the comments he's made during that defamation case, that there was no mistreatment by Linda Reynolds or Michaelia Cash towards Brittany Higgins. So doesn't that then strengthen Linda Reynolds' claim that she was defamed?
It depends. It depends on what was actually said, and you've got to remember this was an argument about postings on social media. It said terrible things about her. It would weaken the truth of what was posted about her, the ability to argue that that was true, that what was posted on social media. So the way things are shaping up, Reynolds seems to be on stronger ground going into these settlement talks than we would otherwise have expected. I don't think there's going to be a settlement. Reynolds is not simply, in my view, she's not simply after money, she's after vindication.
Yeah.
She was the butt of the opposition's campaign in Parliament, underprivileged, that there was a cover-up by the
And she suffered for it, no question. Her career, her reputation, her health. You know, remember she ended up in hospital with that heart condition. People were ridiculing her and she was actually quite sick. But, you know, a lot of people are looking at Brittany Higgins and David Shiraz flaunting their new life in France on social media, that the 5-bedroom chateau. Meanwhile, most families are struggling to just afford petrol and groceries. And Brittany's now become quite famous, a household name. Do you think Linda Reynolds would have any success in trying to get their assets frozen in France? And also, you know, what if the corruption agency does investigate this and does find that that payment shouldn't have been made or the process was corrupt? I mean, is there any recourse for that taxpayer funds, the $2.4 million, ever being, you know, withdrawn?
Look, we're a long way from an outcome in this. We don't even know whether the Corruption Commission is going to have a look at it. But if that settlement was secured through improper means and there was fraud involved, there would be capacity to claw back that money. So we've got two possible ways in which that $2.4 million could be placed at risk. The first is a damages and legal costs order to Linda Reynolds, and the second is an order from a court to pay that money back if, and it's a big if, it turns out that it was a result of a fraudulent process.
Extraordinary story, it never ends, and we'll keep reporting on it. Chris Merritt, thank you so much for joining me.
Okay.
Now, there are reports that the Obamas are planning a shock bid for the White House, not the former president, but his wife, Michelle. She reportedly started meeting hedge fund CEOs as far back as 2022. This is according to the New York Post, and she allegedly told them that she's running and she was asking for their support. The famous columnist for the New York Post, Cindy Adams, has revealed these secret moves. She says the plan is for Joe Biden to announce he's not going to run in May, citing health concerns. Now, Michelle has been very subtly dropping hints lately. Have a listen to her on this podcast.
What's going to happen in this next election? I am terrified about what could possibly happen because our leaders matter. Who we select, who speaks for us, who holds that bully pulpit. It affects us in ways that sometimes I think people take for granted.
Look, it would certainly make the US election contest far more interesting, and perhaps she'd give Donald Trump a run for his money because Joe Biden certainly can't. Now, after the break, stick around to find out if interest rates could be cut and our must-watch interview with the man who exposed terrorists inside a United Nations agency. Our exclusive in a moment. Welcome back. Well, revelations this week of war crimes against UNRWA. That's the United Nations Relief and Works Agency. The allegations are that some of their workers actually took part in the terror attacks on October 7. This is an organisation that's received $200 million in Australian taxpayer funds over the last decade, and hundreds of millions more from the United States and other countries. This is despite repeated warnings over the years that the money sent to UNRWA was being used to aid Hamas terror. At first, UN officials laughed off suggestions made by my next guest that UNRWA employees supported Hamas. Well, now they're not laughing, with countries worldwide suspending funding. United Nations Watch Executive Director Hillel Neuer gave evidence to Congress today in Washington on UNRWA's terror links, and I spoke with him straight afterwards. Here's that exclusive interview. Hillel Neuer, thank you so much for your time. You've been exposing UNRWA since 2015. What are the main problems you've uncovered institutionally with the organisation over the years?
We have exposed, and that's something that is available for people who are not in Gaza. We're not in Gaza. It's a closed regime controlled by Hamas. But through Facebook, we get to visit, virtually to see inside their schools. And we discover that there's a woman named Elham Mansour, among hundreds of other UNRWA teachers, who incites to the slaughter of Jews. And I spoke to the Congress today and testified at this hearing, and I quoted her post that she made in June of 2022 or May of 2022, where she wrote on Facebook, a teacher that works for the UN, teaches Palestinians, and she said, you need to slaughter Jews, don't let any Israeli live. This is our obligation as Muslims. So if you ask me, was I shocked on October 7th? Yes, I was traumatized. I was in Jerusalem at the time. I was in a bomb shelter. But to be honest, it is a logical consequence of the message of UNRWA. And our latest report shows 3,000 UNRWA teachers in a Telegram chat group who celebrated the massacre of October 7th. UNRWA is an organization that is not there to help Palestinians get resettled. The contrary, they're meant to perpetuate Palestinians in a situation of refugee status and victimhood, one generation after another. No other people in the world is doomed to this kind of fate.
Well, Hillel, some world leaders and other figures like AOC say that terrorism within UNRWA doesn't matter. It's only a few individuals, and the funding should continue to flow. What's your response to people like this?
Look, Sharri, you're quite right. There have been a number of prominent figures who are apologists for the Hamas narrative and apologists for UNRWA. They include, you mentioned AOC, the squad radical left congresswoman in America, but they also include Ken Roth, the former head of Human Rights Watch, the current top people at Human Rights Watch, Jan Egeland, who is a former UN official and head of the Norwegian Refugee Council, as well as Agnes Callamard. She's the head of Amnesty International. All of them have fallen in lockstep into line, saying, reading off the same talking points, it's a few bad apples. It's just a few bad apples. It's just a dozen UNRWA workers who were found to have personally participated in the attacks of October 7th. That's, their argument. But of course, it's not just a dozen. We learned in the Wall Street Journal yesterday that 1,200 estimated UNRWA workers belong to Hamas or Islamic Jihad. Another 6,000 are estimated to have a family member who's in Hamas or Islamic Jihad. UNRWA is rotten to the core. My great-grandfather came to Canada fleeing persecution in Russia, and he was a refugee from Russia. I grew up in Canada, and my family's been there for over 100 years. We're not Russian refugees, we're Canadian citizens. So Palestinians who've been living in Jordan for 70 odd years, who have Jordanian passports and citizenship, why does the UN list them as refugees? Why are Australian taxpayers paying for Palestinian refugees in Jordan when they're Jordanian citizens? The whole thing is absurd. It's all to serve a political agenda, which is to dismantle Israel. It's an agenda of war. It has nothing to do with what a humanitarian organization is supposed to do.
I mean, Hillel, you look at countries like Australia. We've given $200 million to UNRWA since 2010. $200 million. What has this funding contributed to?
Well, look, the international community gave, as you indicated, hundreds of millions of dollars, for example, to give cement to Palestinians to build homes, hospitals, schools. But when you're raised with the education that you get at UNRWA, which is your home is not in Gaza, Palestinians in Gaza are told, even though you're in Palestine, this is not your home. Your home is where your grandfather and great-grandfather were in Haifa and Tel Aviv. You're going to go back to Israel. We're going to undo Israel. And so they naturally used the cement not to build homes, hospitals, and schools, but to build hundreds of miles of terror tunnels. It's bigger. Their infrastructure is more extensive than the London Tube, than most countries have for their subway system. The Palestinians are very resourceful, and they have resources. The problem is that their priorities are to build terrorist infrastructure, bombs, weapons, and terror tunnels. And that is naturally what they did with the cement, to build tunnels, to tunnel into Israel and to invade Israel. So October 7th is a logical consequence. And Australia paid for it. So did Canada, my country, and many other countries. I saw the statement by your foreign minister. She said, we're suspending funds, but UNRWA is great. They swiftly responded. They're investigating. We have confidence in them. Confidence in UNRWA to investigate? UNRWA can't investigate. They couldn't care less. UNRWA is unwilling, unable, and unfit to conduct an investigation into how their organization is riddled with support for terrorism. For 10 years, we've been sending them the information. They never called us. They never asked, give us more evidence, help us solve the problem. They really just tried to obstruct. And we should have zero faith and confidence in any idea of a UN investigation.
Look, I'm glad you made that point about our foreign minister, because Penny Wong has been willfully ignoring the evidence linking UNRWA to terrorism. We've been reporting it here. You've exposed it. But what's the solution here? How can countries give aid to innocent Palestinians? Is there an organisation that's immune from having their funding exploited by terrorists?
When there are crises in Haiti, in Sudan, in Syria, the UN is very capable of dealing with not 2 million, but 7 million people in crisis, of sending in trucks of aid and sending in a cluster of all kinds of aid groups that get funded by various donors. There's the WHO, there's the WFP, the World Food Program. There's numerous, UNDP, numerous agencies are very well equipped to show up, give out aid, and aid that you're not guaranteed will go to Hamas. There will be challenges no matter what, but the notion that there's no alternative, we can find alternatives. May not be today to tomorrow, but we need to begin working on it, because I'll tell you, in the Congress today, not just Republicans, but Democrats, I think, have had it up to here with UNRWA. And the notion that they're stuck, they have no choice but to give money to a terrorist-dominated organization. There are other choices, and we're going to start to find them. And again, it may not be today to tomorrow, but I think the days of UNRWA are numbered. And if anyone cares for the Palestinians, they should begin to take this seriously and to find good alternatives.
Hillel Nua, you've done the most extraordinary work exposing UNRWA. Thank you so much for joining us tonight once again.
Thank you, Sharri.
And coming up, Jim Chalmers tries to woo voters in Dunkley today as the government deflects from its broken promise. Plus, the extraordinary moment Israeli forces, disguised as women, take down terrorists. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, last night on this show, I told you that the coalition and Peter Dutton was ramping up his attack on the Prime Minister over his broken promise on the Stage 3 tax cuts and that they'd be launching an attack ad against Labor. Well, that rolled out today. Have a look.
There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead.
They've been legislated. We support them. We stand by that.
Joining me now, National Senate Leader Bridget McKenzie and former Labor MP Michael Danby. Terrific political panel tonight. Great to see you both.
Evening.
Bridget, clearly the government's trying to put the pressure back onto Peter Dutton, to you and the coalition, to say whether you're going to support Labor's tax package. These ads have rolled out today. Dutton clearly wants to let Albanese stew in his broken promise for a bit longer, but ultimately you will have to make a decision. Where do you expect the coalition will land on this?
Well, Sharri, this ad absolutely articulates for the Australian public the fact that Anthony Albanese and his government completely misled and lied to the Australian government, to the Australian people. And it's something that Australians need to be very, very clear about, because anything these guys and gals say for the next 18 months can't be believed. And that is the essential issue. Now, when it comes to whether the coalition will be voting for the legislation, yet to be seen, on these tax changes, we really do need to see the detail. We need to understand the impact on the bottom line. We think that Treasury has modelled this, that it's going to cost Australians $28 billion more over coming years in taxes than the current legislated tax changes. So there's a whole lot of things we need to assess and weigh up and to understand the types of amendments we will be seeking to move.
Ultimately, it would be political suicide, wouldn't it, if the coalition voted against more tax relief for vulnerable Australians when we're in this cost of living crisis?
Well, the coalition will always be the lower taxing side of Parliament. We always have been, we always will be, and heading into the next election, that will absolutely be the case. I mean, Australians are already paying 27% more in taxes just in the last 18 months as a result of the change in government. So we will be making our position very, very clear, but I'm wondering when Treasury was actually asked to model these changes, how long ago had the government been thinking about this tax change? They're the sorts of questions we're going to be prosecuting in Senate inquiries, because people need to understand, was this just a thought bubble over summer? Because Australians have been struggling with the cost of living crisis for a lot longer, and despite everything, Australians with a $750,000 mortgage are still paying an additional $24,000 a year to keep their own home. So tax changes aside, this legislation aside, won't change anything.
Michael, there was some good news today that, you know, there's even hope that there could be an interest rate cut when the RBA meets next Tuesday. The latest inflation data showing a drop to 4.1% in December compared to 5.4% in September. I mean, this isn't back to the target range, but look, it's good news. It's heading in the right direction.
Yeah, well, Albo will be hoping that the booing at the tennis wasn't his Brandon moment, like President Biden experienced. But no one in Australia denigrates good developments for the average person, and interest rates are crucial to people's mortgage repayments, and it's an absolutely vital stake. You'll see what happens, I think, as a result of this change in promises. Although it benefits a lot of people, I think a lot of people might just take it, and the booing at the tennis might be symptomatic of the fact that some people don't like broken promises, even if it doesn't affect them.
Bridget, we're learning today that a live export ship of 15,000 Australian sheep has been forced to turn around to avoid the Houthi rebels in the Red Sea. I mean, our sheep now. This ship with 15,000 sheep is stuck off the West Australian coast. There's bureaucratic biosecurity red tape now. I mean, this is quite extraordinary. We refused to send a warship to the Red Sea. Now we've had export ships turn around. This is actually starting to have quite a severe impact on our own import and exports.
And I think it shows the folly of not joining our allies in the need to actually deal with the Houthis in the Red Sea and those shipping laneways being blocked, not just for freight and trade issues for our allies, but for us here at home. It does have an impact. We export 80% of what we grow here on our farms right throughout the country. So keeping the seaways open across the world is critical to our own economic development. Now, with this particular ship, it has been ordered back. My understanding, there is no animal welfare concern. We have the highest animal welfare standards in the world when it comes to the export of live cattle and sheep, and we need to be proud of that. So I can absolutely report that those strict regulations that we've got in place to ensure animal welfare standards are met are in place, and it is just, again, highlighting the need for this government needs to get their act together when it comes to joining our allies and joining the fight.
Exactly, not just ignoring yet another US request. Michael, I want to speak to you about this quite stunning vision that emerged today. Everyone's talking about it. Israeli forces dressed up as Palestinian women to attack 3 Hamas terrorists inside a hospital in the West Bank. I mean, this is quite amazing. And the fact that no one else was harmed, it was a targeted attack, they snuck in there in disguise, it's incredible. It's
more like the TV series Fauda, isn't it,
it is.
Sharri, than real life. But in fact, it shows that despite their failures on October 7th, the Israelis still have very good intelligence, including all the stuff about UNRWA comes from the vision cameras on the head of the Hamas terrorists and from their intercepted telephone calls. I mean, these guys that we're fighting are not always the brightest. You know, the Houthis are doing their military parades in sacks and sandals, and the whole thing wouldn't be happening. I hope the Australian people understand this, unless the Iranian regime was feeding all of these people's weapons, ammunition, money, targeting of our ships in the Red Sea and cruise missiles. The first time ever an anti-ship ballistic missile was used against a ship in the Red Sea. Terrible days, Sharri.
Just turning to Ukraine now. I mean, this is another area where the Albanese government may not have the best record. We're reading a report that Ukraine now has the world's lowest birth rate. This is after 2 years of war. And also in question, just this rocky relationship with the Albanese government after they refused to donate our unused Taipan helicopters. There's a story in the Fin Review today by Aaron Patrick, and he says that defence officials seem reluctant to give away vehicles in use, including the Hawkeye armoured Jeep, and they haven't preempted Ukrainian requests for equipment that they don't need. Bridget, look, is there anything more that the government should be doing to help our allies in Ukraine?
Absolutely, Sharri. Richard Marles should pick up the phone and actually have a physical conversation with the Minister of Defence over there. Clearly, there is a mismatch in communication about the needs of Ukraine as they attempt to defend their democracy against the authoritarianism of Russia. And it is our responsibility, as it is our responsibility in Gaza, to stand with our allies and defend democracy wherever it's under threat around the world. Now, it seems to me there is incredible mismatch between communication about what is the need and how can we help. That is only fixed by speaking. And if the defence officials can't get it right, it needs to come from the minister to minister and then filter down.
Yeah, there's definitely a breakdown somewhere. Michael Danby, Ukraine is very close to your heart. You've visited there a number of times. Do you think the war is slipping from everyone's mind because there's just so much else happening?
That's the truth. I'm hoping to go there in a few weeks' time after the Berlin Film Festival, Sharri, but the Ukrainians need those helicopters because they don't have a way of medevacing people out to crisis hospitals further down the line. How cruel and heartless of it of us in Australia is it not to provide them? I mean, it's not even for a warlike purpose. Richard Marles, you're the Defence Minister. Get on the phone to what Greg Sheridan calls Fort Fumbles, the Department of Defence, and tell them you're the boss. Don't cut those helicopters up. Put them on a plane that the Ukrainians offered to send to Australia, and they'll fix them over there.
And instead, they're now in a scrap heap being disassembled this week. It's just, I mean, the mind boggles.
Terrible.
It is. Bridget McKenzie, Michael Danby, thank you both so much for your time. Now, after the break, it happened to Taylor Swift. Could it happen to any of you? Why nobody is safe from deep fake technology. Stay tuned. Well, earlier this week, if you tried to search for photographs of Taylor Swift on Twitter, can't imagine why you would have, but if you did, you would have been blocked. That's because fake images of the pop star had found their way onto the site, and staff were trying to reduce their spread. These were made using artificial intelligence, and they were so lifelike that they were considered a perfect example of deep fakes. In New Hampshire, we saw a similar thing where technology was used to recreate Joe Biden's voice for an automated call sent out to voters, encouraging them not to vote in New Hampshire primaries and instead to wait until November. But he never recorded it. These two examples are exposing real concerns about what we can and can't trust on our screens. Well, joining me now is editor of the technology and men's lifestyle website, EFTM.com, Trevor Long. Trevor, great to see you. Look, what is this new world of deep fakes, and how can we tell if something is genuine or not?
Sharri, good evening. It's a troubling world we're moving into here because it has become so easy for anyone to create these things. So if you consider that a year ago, it was very hard to mimic Joe Biden's voice and create a message. Today, I could probably do it for you in about 10 minutes and make him say whatever I wanted. Voice is probably the easiest of all. And then you take image manipulation and you say, especially for someone like Taylor Swift, of whom there are many millions of photos, very easy to create a model that says, I can just type anything and have her standing in whatever position, wearing whatever she wants, and it's all artificial. The problem is, as you've mentioned, detecting it. And unfortunately, there isn't going to be a simple way other than verifying the source. And which people on social media are going to bother to do that?
I mean, you know, we've already had state actors like Russia and China trying to influence our democracy and our elections in the West. I mean, you just put this deep fake technology into the mix and it's a whole nother ball game.
That's right. And I think that's the challenge for the next 8 or 9 months leading up to the US election and then elections around the world, including our own. Now, some of this stuff can be used quite smartly by a political party who might, mimic their leader's voice to create a two-way conversation. So instead of a robocall, it's actually a two-way conversation where they've created a programmed a computer that can talk in the way of the language of the political party as opposed to the opposition, and therefore actually sell themselves to someone. So forget the voice recordings. It's going to get interactive as well, both for positive and negative purposes. And then you put on top of that the scams that are happening for average Aussies and people around the world who are falling victim to scams because they think they're real. It's a real problem for us today, and unfortunately, I don't have an answer as to how we solve the problem.
Yeah, and now we hear as well today, Elon Musk and brain chips. I tell you what, artificial intelligence is something I don't think we should be rushing into. Trevor Long, thank you so much for your time. That's all we've got time for tonight. Thanks for watching. I'll see you tomorrow at 8. And here's Paul Murray.